All right, we'll get started. So hello, and today we're in conversation, courtesy of Zoom, and we have Matthew Sleeth, who is an amazing artist who's currently based in Melbourne and enjoying lockdown. Jonathan Parsons, who is the creative director for Experimenta and is sitting up in Brisbane, and myself, Lubi Thomas, who is Experimenta's curator at large and currently able to still move around. So I'm enjoying maybe a last day or two with Jonathan here in Brisbane. So to get rolling in these extraordinary times, this is part of the Ars Electronica online festival, which is the first time that Ars Electronica have created such an experiment. And I think it's probably the first time for all of us as well, participating in something that's working at this global scale. So this is part of a conversation with Matthew regarding an amazing project that has been running for about 5 years. That's been in partnership with Experimenta. But before we kind of hit on the project, which you're able to see a single channel video of on the Experimenta website, on the Ars Electronica Festival website. I'd just like to, first of all, Matthew, come to you and ask you a bit about your practice. Some people definitely know you and know your practice, but this is a global audience. And so there are many people that are kind of coming to you and your practice for the first time. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a sense of, where did your practice start from and what's been the journey? Because you have a really, truly multidisciplinary practice.
Hey, Luby, thank you. It's a lovely introduction. Wow, that's the way back version of it is my father was a very keen amateur photographer. So we were like 4 or 5 years old and brought out into the darkroom and lifted up and, saw the magic of, the image develop in the developer when we were very young. And I think that's always stayed with me. I started my practice with photography and film. I went to film school, but was always taking pictures well before that and well after that. And then started a collective with Peter Milne, Helen Freeman, Ricky Maynard, Chris Collar in the early 90s while I was still at uni, called M33, which is still going. And we were sort of looking to publish books and exhibit photography at a time when that was very difficult in Australia. And so that's sort of where I came from. And then I'd always made videos and was always making sculptures as well. But I was sort of really most interested in making machines and in what a machine could make and see. And it's the language of technology. And so very early internet, the very early kind of versions of automation as well and electronics. And so it sort of became this practice that I really sort of thought about why I was obsessed with photography, realizing that, you're not born obsessed with a medium. What is the thing about photography that made me obsessed? And I was really obsessed. I was really doing this 20 hours a day for, my teens and 20s, and was sort of like, it was the set of instructions that I realized eventually was the attraction. It wasn't a camera. It wasn't really a lens, although the way a camera works and the way a lens draws the world is really amazing. But it was this idea that you weren't touching the material. You weren't kind of molding the clay or mixing the paint and touching a canvas. You were setting a set of instructions that a machine would play out. And so the first set of instructions I realized was the negative. And I would make my own prints and I would see how the machine interpreted those instructions. And then that became computer code, and then that became video, and then that became 3D printing, and that became, CNC routed molds for casting concrete and various other things. So all of those languages through, water jet cutting sculptures or 3D printing or, cast concrete sculpture, I started to think of those. Well, what I realized that for me, they were all photography, that if all of these different languages, were, the languages that sprung from those technologies, then the language that kind of was central to them all, the language that was the Latin for me was photography.
Actually, it's really interesting as well, because you're at that age, similar maybe to all of us, which is where we were probably born into an analog world and kind of grew up in a digital. And I think you kind of that awareness of of machinery and of language, because it wasn't as accessible. You know, you had to learn your basic language to get the computer to do a thing for you. You know, sort of how do you think kind of that influence actually of just being that age and this point in time kind of impacted on your practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. It's one I think about often, actually, is that I think I was super lucky to cross over. I was actually the last year at my university that taught analog. And then after that, it became purely digital. And early digital was so hard to, to access, even computers early on. I mean, I went to a quite strict religious school that I didn't really enjoy very much, but they had computers. And so that idea of getting access to computers, in the first computer science course I did, they didn't want to waste computer time on students. So you had to write the algorithms out by hand, and they would mark them by hand, and they would never go to a computer. And so that's very hard to imagine now, those early days. Even the first versions of Photoshop and Quantel were like so expensive that I would actually sort of, with beer, I would bribe people at advertising agencies that I knew to let me come in after they'd left and leave at 6 a.m. before they would come in for the day. It was just really difficult to get access to all of that. But what became apparent really quickly is that there's no real new knowledge, that all of those things are, are cumulative, and that the kind of genealogy of digital is really, particularly early digital, was embedding analog knowledge. And so Photoshop in particular, is almost sort of, and skeuomorphic design is still acknowledging that what it really was taking was burning in the darkroom and making an analog version of that, and actually having the little icon being the symbol for burning in the darkroom. And so what I realized is learning it in analog first meant I knew what was going on under the hood with the digital. So it wasn't just an algorithm that was a black box. It was something that I could see the translation happening. So I consider myself really lucky, actually, to have had that opportunity to print in analog first and work in analog first, and actually see how hard that was in many ways, and what the digital equivalent has become.
Yeah. And still people that are kind of pushing the digital, I think, would feel your pain. They have the same experience that, in the 90s we were all having with what is now standard computers, just that determination to try and make the thing do something. I mean, interestingly, this is also kind of, a synergy with Experimenta. Experimenta grew very much out of a crew, which you probably are very aware of in those early days as well, out of video and experimental art at the time. Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about the emergence of Experimenta in terms of, it's very much at this same point in time as Matthew's practice was developing in those early years?
Well, it's true that the original Experimenta was an organisation, an artist-run organisation called MIMA, Modern Image Makers, and as the name suggests, it was started by a group of experimental video and filmmakers. So the genesis of, and this was in the mid to late 1980s. And really the whole project with Experimenta is to follow the pathways that arts practice has taken, driven by technology. And it has morphed and changed according to the different tools available to artists, always driven by what artists are interested in, and always an eye to what might be the next kind of artistic expressions and the new forms, and supporting that, and supporting artists to push the boundaries of their own practice.
So I can imagine you were both very aware of each other, both being also based in Melbourne. But how did kind of, the creative journey between yourself, Matthew, and Experimenta, how did that kind of, those initial conversations come together? And really, what was the impetus for you to both kind of join together in a collaboration for what has become a long-term project known as Drone Opera? But I'll come to Drone Opera in a minute. But really, why did you seek each other out?
Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, I was aware of Jono's practice, and I was very aware of Experimenta. I would go to the exhibitions. I was, I think one of the outcomes of those early resources being difficult and expensive is a sort of people would bind together, and you would have to, kind of as a community, have to find out the ways that you would access those things together and work them out together. And so that was sort of the nice outcome of that. So I knew a lot of people that exhibited with Experimenta or had commissions for Experimenta, and so I essentially was a fan. I knew the organisation. But I sort of came to Experimenta a little bit directly through Jonathan. I had an idea for a project for Isaiah in 2013, and we sort of started talking about a version of a drone opera there. It actually started as a gallery project in New York, and I was living in New York at the time, and my gallerist sort of had said that they would allow me to do a drone painting in the gallery with attach paintball guns to drones and put canvases at each end of a gallery and have the opening night's performance be these drones painting. And then through a whole lot of, legal and difficult reasons why that wasn't, you're not actually allowed to arm drones in America. That's actually the short version of it. That's how it became, the gallery was worried.
Somewhat surprising, really.
I mean, maybe that was lucky we weren't allowed to do that. But, and so I think I approached you with a version of that was going to be a free performance before the main performances at Carriageworks in Isaiah. And we had a long...
This just for people, this was Isaiah in Sydney, and I was the creative director of Isaiah.
That's right. Yeah, and so after, sort of getting quite excited about that and deciding on, that it became too expensive, I think, was the difficulty. And we decided on another project, which became the Generative Freeway project, which is the 3 or 4 3D printers in the gallery that a couple of them I had built as part of a project, and that we would have them in the gallery the whole time. We'd start with an empty gallery and they would print parts of a freeway, and people would come into the gallery and talk to me, and we would discuss, how to extend the freeway, and together we would build the freeway. So it was generated by the machines, but it was also generated by the audience. And then for the last night of the exhibition, we had a party, a friend did a performance, and Kayla Davies, and then people just took parts of the sculpture home to and ended with an empty gallery. So to emphasize that the artwork was the process of the performance of its making rather than the pieces of plastic. And then when Jonathan became artistic director of Experimenta, I'm not sure if you called me or I called you, but I think I might have called and said, hey, how about we do this now? And I think you said maybe.
Yeah, well, I did say maybe. And then, and you were very smart, Matthew. Then you took me out late at night on a Friday night. You invited me on a little journey to meet a subculture in Melbourne. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
That's right. Yeah, I didn't tell you where we were going. I think I said, what are you doing on Friday night?
Yeah.
Let's go and get a drink or something. And then we got really far out, like it's about an hour. It's the outskirts of Melbourne, and you were getting a bit worried where I was taking you. And there was one car park that we found that was part of a big shopping centre that had a cinema, and so all the cars were gone after the shops closed, but they left the lights on until the cinema ended. And we would just meet there every Friday night with the drones that we'd built during the week. And the rule was you couldn't fly anything you hadn't made, and that if you turned up, everyone had to fly. And that was kind of the vibe. And it was just a group of people that were made, and that was the very, very early days. But it really was the beginnings, I guess, of drone racing. But that was just a lot of fun, and it was social, and it was something that I could see very early, the movement potential in it and the choreography of it. And so I actually hadn't mentioned it to the pilots yet, but I think I said to you, let's do this thing. Let's do an opera. Let's do a live performance. These guys will be I'm going to ask these guys to be the pilots. And what do you think? Is that roughly right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think you've touched on this. I think, it's really hard to imagine actually that in 2013, how underground the kind of the drone culture was in Australia at that time.
Yeah, and how much it mimicked the early kind of video culture or the early internet culture or the early... And one of the things that Melbourne was really good at, in the early hacker days, Melbourne was the centre of that. It's a culture that does lend itself to communities and sharing knowledge. And and how hard that was in the early days. You couldn't actually go and buy a drone that would do the things we wanted to do, even if you wanted to, even if you could afford it. And so it was, those early languages tend to be, 3D printing or anything else, they tend to be difficult and expensive unless you find a way of, making your own fun. And I think one of the things Melbourne's, arts community is really good at is making its own fun. And so it's one of the reasons why I really like living here.
Yeah. And for me, because I was only fairly newly appointed as artistic director at Experimenta, and really its key project has been this big national touring exhibition, now the triennial. And given my background is quite, I have a broad range in the arts, I was very conscious that the exhibition can only cater for a certain amount of the practice of artists working with technology in interesting ways. So I was on the lookout for something that was that would not be suited to the gallery context. And I remember you talking about how you were really interested in the fact that drones were this abstract idea to most people. People were starting to become aware of them, but no one had actually experienced them. So you kept talking about that kind of the physical experience of being close to drones to give people some sense of what this technology might be about, which I think kind of naturally led to the idea of performance as opposed to a gallery context.
Yeah. And I actually also think, you'd already touched on it because you ran into this problem in America, which is that drones have become militarized almost immediately upon their existence. And this kind of, so I think there's something really interesting there, because you were thinking about drones also from a perspective of, camera, POV, being able to do a whole bunch of things with shot and image and creating images in new ways on a drone, system as well. So that's sort of another, I guess that was sort of part of your thinking as well about that kind of militarization of this tool.
Yeah, I mean, they're the two ideas really that drove the project from the beginning. And I knew from the start almost what the first and last scene would be. Jono and I talked about this idea of what, I really came and I said, I don't think this can be a video installation. Okay. I mean, I don't think this should start as a video installation. I think people should feel the wind, and they, the rotors generate a lot of wind. They're noisy. There's a phenomenology to it. And it goes to the military context of what was happening at the time. That was the height of Obama's drone program, that had started to become like almost a global policing effort. And so you would read every day in the papers that a drone strike had taken out, this convoy or that terrorist leader or those group of people. And it's so unilateral, it became policing. And I was very interested in that idea of what happens when there's no risk to one side and we trust what they say about the targets, that these are legitimate targets, or really assassination now becomes a legitimate strategy. And how do you turn that into and so what I was worried about when I read about it, what I experienced when I read about it, is it's such an abstraction. So if you just read, a convoy was taken out in a drone strike, that's a very, very different thing to experiencing what that might be, not only for the victim, but what it might be for a pilot and what it might be for a commander, and what it might be to have watched those people for days and days before that. And so I was really interested in what's the kind of most visceral and physical way you can have a conversation about what that political abstraction might mean. And so that was really the beginnings of the opera.
So just out of interest, at this point, Matthew, had you sort of done performance works or performative works as such? I mean, Jonathan, this is a field that, you really come from. So is that sort of, can you sort of unpack this idea and your experience to date on that before drone opera?
Yeah, well, Jonathan's laughing probably gives that away, but yeah, no, I think the second thing I said after come to me to the car park in Ringwood was I never done this before. So I had never directed an opera, a live performance before. I mean, I've been very interested in the performative nature of photography and film, but live performance was something I'd never done. And in fact, one of the reasons why I wanted to work with Jono is I said, I haven't done this before and I'm going to need some help. And I'm going to I have a process that I trust as an artist that I'm confident we can get to a work, but I'm going to need some help. And part of that process is asking, people that know a lot more about this than I do to come and help me. And I also asked Jono for some suggestions about who should help me. Like, I knew that there was some visual artists I really wanted to work with whose practices I was a big fan of, that I knew in the past, like Phil Samartzis with the sound, and Robin Fox with the lasers and the set design, and Kate Richards as a producer, and I'd known Kate's work as an artist very well. And so that was really the start of the process of being very upfront and acknowledging, I haven't done this. What's the process for making something like this happen?
And I guess from my point of view, I mean, I grilled Matthew because to just see whether he was really genuine, and that it actually, the conceptual ideas that he wanted to, or the ideas that he wanted to explore in the work, supported performance and vice versa. And certainly Experimenta is really, one of its key aims is to support artists to push their practice. So from that sense, it fitted. But the thing for me always that is, if you're venturing new territory, you want to do it in a supported way, not just throw people in the deep end. So we talked a lot about the building, if you like, the curating of the team, and making sure that there were people with experience and expertise in performance as part of the collaborative team.
So can we talk about that team? Because you had a team of amateur drone flyers who definitely, I make judgment here, but may not have gone to an opera before and probably haven't been involved in an arts project. You have opera singers, you have, Robin Fox, who's an amazing, light artist. You've got an amazing sound artist, sort of not just the bringing them together, but just sort of what happens when you kind of bring that collection of people together in that kind of collaborative format.
Yeah, I mean, and Shelley Lassiter is the choreographer as well. And that idea of, one of the ways I knew I would be the most comfortable, and that Jonathan and I talked about, was I wanted to ask the people who I had enjoyed their practice and knew their work and was a fan of. So I sort of knew that the most comfortable I would be was knowing that everyone else was so much better at this than I was, that I could just sort of follow a process that I knew would work, but that the people that were doing it were so experienced and so good that, and people also that, I mean, one of the other things we talked about was who do we want to spend, 10 hours a day with for weeks on end, and who knows how to do that, and who will be fun. I mean, I think I made the joke to Jono that, I'd always wanted to be in a band when I was a kid, and that this is the closest I was ever going to come. And it was so much fun that everyone was so good and knew what they were doing so well that we were able to experiment and go to the edges maybe a little bit faster than we could have otherwise, and go to see what the boundaries of that performance would be. Like you're saying with the drone pilots, there was 3 pilots from the car park that night. One was a particularly good friend, someone I've known for a long time. But, without actually having asked them, I think it's probably not only the first time they've been to an opera, it's probably the first time they've been to a theatre. And so they were quite nervous about performance, but they were very, very confident in what they were doing. And so it was really about a process of saying to everyone, the artists in particular, saying, what do you need and what conditions do you need? And this is sort of the conversations Jono and I had very often was, what does everyone need? How do I create the conditions for everyone to feel they can do their best? And
I remember suggesting to you Kate Richards, which is someone that you didn't know, who has a lot of experience in working in the art and technology field, has both a visual arts practice, but also strong experience in the performing arts. And she was quite a linchpin in terms, don't you think, in terms of as we rounded out the team to achieve this.
Yeah, so Kate was sort of pivotal, and I was very grateful for that introduction. I'd actually known Kate's work, but not Kate personally. So I was aware of Wayfarer and other projects like that. But and Kate also was a dramaturg as well. So there's sort of idea of someone who could produce this, but also understand how to construct the drama in it as well, and structure was very important, and pacing and things that are so different in video and film and photography that, particularly film, like the durational experience of film is so different to the durational experience of live performance. And someone who understood that as well as Kate did was really important.
But you did understand the narrative structure. I think that, but what you did, what I remember it being a revelation that when, that in performance, when you get the performance to the point where you have an audience in front of it for the first time, is the beginning of a whole new process. And I remember our conversation about that. It was like a light bulb went off in your head and went, oh, right. Because of course, film, you don't do that. You've got a product, it's fixed. And to a large extent, that happens in the visual arts too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've really taken from this project into my visual art practice as well, and film practice as well, is the development process of theatre is, I think, the most rigorous I've seen. It's such a good process to devise work, to do it in a group, to do it as in front of an audience, and to keep testing at every point in a way that maybe visual art doesn't. And so the idea that, the thing you said to me of, when we watched it with the first audience was, you said, don't watch the show, watch the audience. And that was actually one of the most helpful things. Just you can tell from an audience with, what they'll tell you, particularly those early audiences that are largely people might be a bit sugar-coated, but what you can tell from how engaged they are by watching them was really a revelation for sure.
So was this always going to just be a performance, or was there this, because obviously the work's gone on to exist in many different formats, so was that always part of the strategy at the beginning? Because there is now this amazing kind of narrative of this work that sort of has achieved, a different language due to both the way in which it's being experienced, but also the way in which the audience is situated, be that in a gallery, film festival, those kind of different environments. So was this destination performance, or did you always have this strategy to keep on unpacking this work?
Sort of is the short answer. Not really to the extent that it's become. I mean, and certainly we never would have imagined a VR sort of virtual version of it that's like the one that's going to be at Ars. But we sort of, always, Jono and I always talked about this idea of at each point, what does the work need to be and what's the best form for it. So when our first discussion was literally about, it needs to be performance because of X, Y, Z, the phenomenology of it, this. And then when we talked about touring it, there was so many people involved, and there was so many people, particularly the pilots had now, would all come from the hacker kind of background, but had grown up and had jobs and they had families, and I knew they wouldn't have traveled, or they told me they wouldn't have traveled. So I knew, and it took an enormous amount of trust to do that safely at a time when the technology didn't allow it to be automated, probably still doesn't. And so that idea of, trust and the people involved meant that I knew that I wouldn't be able to have the same people again if we did it again, that it would just not be the same. So I was also at the same time really fascinated by understanding, knowing what film does and knowing and now having this experience of live performance and seeing the difference between them and seeing what would happen if this became a video installation. How would it change? What would it lose and what would it gain? How could you do it? So the discussion Jonathan and I had early on was that we would not tour it, but we would make a video installation that we would tour. And so right from the beginnings, which gave us the advantage of a year before, we knew we could film. So there was two feature film cinematographers, Dave McKinnar and Sherman Akdazabar, who I had known their work and worked together before. And we were able to film the world of the drone opera, not necessarily the performances, but the experimentation, the things that didn't make the performance, the development process, right from a year or so before the performances, then all the way through rehearsals, then all the way through the performances. And so it meant we had a body of footage that included the performances, but was something else. And so the discussion we sort of had about the video installation was, what can we do that we didn't, and in fact, this is well before the performances, what can we do that we can't do in the performances? And what's an experience that the audience can have that they can't have in the video installation? So in the live performances, I mean. So you know, you can go closer, you can move, you can show faces, you can show expressions, you can show things. So the opportunities for a video installation were always there, and we knew that we wanted to explore them from day one. And so it gave that opportunity to compare the two mediums in a way that I'd never have the opportunity to do, and to create what I thought of as two very different works.
So we're actually pre-recording this conversation, and before I just kind of ask the last question, by the time this goes to air as part of the festival, there will actually be a Q&A session which will be live. And I guess at that point, I think we'll be in a slightly different space again, which is that we're on iteration 4, I think, of how does this work exist in the Ars Electronica Festival, in the Mozilla Hub. And I think that will be really interesting for you to, you know, because at the moment we're busy putting all that together, but for you to kind of have a look at that, and all of us to have a you know, check it out and reflect on that, because I think that's another new step. I think it's delightful that the whole project has really continues to be driven by bountiful experimentation and just seeing what happens, rather than often visual artists, you know, would like a little bit more surety about how it's going to occur, where this is very much driven by, you know, experimentation, suck and see, get good people in, so you take a lot of the risk out, but also allow that kind of playful experimental engagement to occur. And I think that takes something quite exceptional by yourself as the artist to kind of take your hands off a bit and allow that to happen. But I guess just before we sign off, because I know we're running out of time, so how's your COVID year been? Locked in the studio, how are you going? And has that kind of given you new opportunities in your thinking and when you're allowed out again?
It has. I might just touch on something you said at the start earlier, though. I mean, this idea that, because it's the time I wanted to thank, you know, the people that I worked with, particularly, you know, Sue Frykberg as a composer for trusting me, with you know, not having made something before, but also Jono and Experimenta for allowing someone to hold. You know, I think one of the things that makes a project like this special and allows things to happen is that people can hold uncertainty a little bit longer. And that doesn't, you know, the longer you can hold uncertainty and see what a work needs to be, the better it's going to be. And that's often not something that you're allowed to do. And so being trusted to do that and having an organisation that understood that has allowed at every point this process of the work finding what it needs to be. You know, after the video installation, it was, you know, finding that it could be a film festival version as well, the one that will be shown, I think, at Ars. And then now finding that it could be a VR thing that will, you know, the VR Mozilla Hub that will be showed at Ars. So that's been a remarkable opportunity, which I'm very grateful for. So thank you. I also, just to answer your question, wanted to, I'm sort of thinking a lot about the past at the moment in lockdown, and I've been, you know, reading, and I'm writing I'm thinking about the past and the future in some ways. The present sort of has ceased to exist, and the past is sort of looking at the patterns of the past and going back over old works and thinking about older projects and seeing what the patterns I want to continue are, and then thinking about works in the future that I'm writing at the moment, and just again finding what things need to be.
Thank you very much for spending some time with us today. Although, you know, you're not going anywhere, so I appreciate that anyway. And Jonathan, thank you very much as well for participating in this Ars Electronica Experimenta Melbourne Garden conversation.
And I really look forward to actually seeing you one day in person again, Matthew, when both Lubi and I can fly down to Melbourne.
Yes, I need some, you know, social interaction for sure.
Yeah. See you later.
Take care.
That was fun. See you guys.
Bye.